Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. This video is going to talk about new criticism. So, unlike the previous videos in this series, the new critics were really the first formal literary school. To a certain extent, the Russian formalists and the Prague school were, and I talked about them in a little bit in my semiotics and structuralism video, but really they were more interested in linguistics necessarily than reading for the meanings of text. The new critics, on the other hand, they were a reading school. They were a critical reading school. So new criticism really develops in the 1930s, late 20s, 30s, and sort of reaches its height in the 50s and into the early 60s. Essentially, new criticism takes the structures developed by the semioticians and the structuralists, particularly the Russian formalists and the Prague school and others who are working in this same sort of vein of mapping particular literary techniques. And the new critics say, all right, these are the tools that we need to understand what makes art universal. And that's what the new critics are really interested in a way, is this idea of art as a universal phenomenon. That what makes a work of art great is that it speaks to something fundamentally human. This is a modernist movement, really. This is a movement that seeks to find a meaning that is not arbitrary and culturally situated. So, the new critics loved poetry. I think poetry, I think it's fair to say that probably the bulk of work done by the new critics was on poetry, some on novels as well, but really they love poetry. And so they look at texts like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the poetry of Robert Frost, the poetry of Emily Dickinson, the poetry of the Romantics, Keats, Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, etc., etc. And they say, all right, the artistic techniques and the grand philosophical or experiential ideas make these universal. Because Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, because it's about the experience of mortality and how we deal with that. It's a fundamentally human question. So they're very interested in that, this idea of big human questions. And that's both a strength and a drawback, as we'll see. But the technique that the new critics pioneer to explore those deep human questions is called close reading. Now, if you've been in a university literature course or even a good high school literature course or English course, you've likely heard the term close reading before. is one of the most important techniques that we use still to this day for literary studies. It's almost impossible to overstate the importance of close reading for English as a discipline. Basically, what close reading involves is you look at the details of a text. So you look particularly at poems. Close reading is very hard to do with novels because of the length of them, but with poems, it's something you can do fairly well. And I've done a video with a close reading of John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, I think it was. It's a Keats poem, regardless. But basically, you look very, very closely and you analyze the text for its literary techniques, for allusions, for these sort of big ideas, and the way that it's exploring the human experience, the artistic experience, whatever it is. So, what close reading largely supersedes is a much more general approach to reading, where you would sort of say, these are the ideas of this text, and you didn't. Older critics prior to the rise of new criticism didn't necessarily ground their arguments about texts in close examination of those texts themselves. The evidence was often, this is a broad generalization, so I hesitate to make it, but the evidence was often a combination of, here's my general reading of this text with, here's what is politically or socially expedient for me. So for instance, I'm reading John Locke's second treatise on government at the moment. There's a lot of biblical quotations that seem more chosen because they happen to sound like they conform to what Locke wants to say, rather than because they're necessarily accurate interpretations of what that Bible passage tells us. The new critics changed this. Like, they're fundamentally opposed to this sort of broad, loose reading. They say, no, what you need is in the text itself. You take the poem or the passage or the short story or whatever it is, and you look at it in detail. It is a contained work of art that tells you everything you need to know. You look at a poem by Blake, for instance. Everything that you need to know about that poem and about why it's a great work of art is contained within it. You have the structure of the poem. You have the metrics, stanza organization, if there's a rhyme scheme, metaphors, similes, alliteration, all of this stuff, all of these literary techniques. The beauty is in the tools that are constructed, the tools that are used to construct this work of art. Basically, this, if we think about this in analogy, this is like looking at a painting. Let's say you look at a Van Gogh, and you look very, very closely at it. You get extremely close. That's as close as I can get, just randomly leaning forward. You get extremely close to this Van Gogh. You look at the brushstrokes. You look at the way that colors play against one another, etc., etc., and you say, this is all that I need in order to understand why this is a great work of art. So this is a detail-oriented reading, which is incredibly important. Again, the foundations of modern English scholarship are laid on close reading. But the big problems with new criticism, one is that they say the only thing that you need to know is what is in that work of art itself. Which means you don't need to appreciate the context of the work all that much. And I actually had a professor in undergrad. He was a very, very old school professor. I think he had probably been educated in the 60s, probably by professors who were new critics themselves. I had him for a half semester course. He taught the Milton side of a Chaucer-Milton class. And he said to us at the beginning of his half of the course, when he teaches American modernist poetry, he doesn't feel like context is important. He doesn't address it at all. So when you read Pound or Eliot or whoever it is, William Carlos Williams, whoever it is, the work itself is all that you need. You don't need to know anything about the society they came from, what social issues there were, what their political values were, what their religious ideology was, etc., etc. None of that stuff is important. But with Milton, it is. I could never figure that out. I could never figure out why with Milton context mattered, but with modernist American poets it didn't. It doesn't make any sense to me. But that's precisely one of the big criticisms that comes in the 60s, particularly of the new critics as a school. Because when you say you don't need to know the context, you ignore the fact that, for instance, Ezra Pound had fascist sympathies. That shapes his work. That's incredibly problematic. But you also ignore, in the search for the universal, you, if you're a new critic, come down on almost exclusively white, almost exclusively male, almost exclusively Euro-American authors. There's a few exceptions. Virginia Woolf makes it in. Emily Dickinson makes it in. Some people, some new critics, I think, worked on Langston Hughes. But by and large, anybody who doesn't represent these universal perspectives from the standpoint of largely white, largely male, largely middle class, largely Euro-American academia, doesn't count as universal. So poets, for instance, like Louise Bennett or Claude McKay, who are Caribbean poets who write in a Caribbean English, a patois or a Creole language, they don't count as universal. A lot of African American authors don't count for the new critics. They simply aren't universal literature. This is also part of the reason why we have the classics canon that we have, and it's now being challenged and expanded to include Middle Eastern texts, to include African texts, to include Asian texts, etc., etc. But the Greco-Roman classics, part of the reason they were considered classics is because they fit into this universal mode identified by people who had a culturally situated connection to those authors, right? So that's one of the big issues with the new critics is they're only really interested in literature that explores universal ideas, and they are not interested in anything that's culturally or socially located. So post-colonial literature is out because it's not universal in the sense that it is particular to a post-colonial society. A lot of African-American literature is out in the sense that it is not universal because it responds specifically to the conditions of oppression and inequality faced by African Americans. A lot of women's literature is not universal because it responds specifically to the conditions of women under patriarchy, etc., etc. You can see where this is going. A very narrow scope with a very specific identity for what counts as universal. And so again, as you get into the 60s especially, people start to say, maybe these other voices are actually legitimate and important, and maybe the perspectives that the new critics identified as universal are themselves culturally situated. Maybe the Romantic poets are not universal, they are specifically situated in Regency-era Britain and Europe. Maybe this is not what the new critics thought. And you also have the twin critique that goes with this, which is you can't just look at a text and say everything we need to know is in there, because the author is not in there. The author is shaped by what's going on in their society. The author is shaped by the values, the attitudes, the prejudices, the concerns, the aspirations of their society, and you can't understand the work fully without appreciating at least some of that context. So that's the thing with the new critics, is on the one hand, they are massively, massively important. Again, you couldn't have contemporary, I've said this a couple of times in the video, but you could not have contemporary English scholarship without the contributions of the new critics, because close reading is the basis for every solid argument that we make today. But at the same time, whether because of the particular way that they read or because of the cultural and social values of the early 20th century, they excluded a lot of people who produced amazing and important revelatory works of literature because they didn't happen to fit a particular model of the universal.